how do military-connected students best prepare to enter and succeed in the workforce? What sets them sort of apart? What experiences set them apart? And what should they do while they're in college to prepare them to enter the workforce? We can kind of go down, or I guess volunteers for whoever wants to start.
So I think from my perspective, and I'm looking at it from the workforce economic development lens, so I probably have a different purview than some of the others, but I think from my perspective, what I've learned in working in the veteran space the past couple years, this is my passion project, is making sure students know while they're still in school what programs and systems are in place to help support them. You know, Ohio has the Ohio Military Friendly website. There's the Ohio Military Friendly Guide that can connect them with different employment resources. There are the military skills resume translator tools that are out there. I would say those are probably the biggest components. I know it's been discussed a couple times already, that translation skills gap is one of those biggest barriers. I think that military connected students and just individuals in general face when trying to find gainful employment. So I think that those would be the biggest takeaways that I would share, is just helping those individuals and those students know what those resources are, who they can reach out to, and helping make those connections for them before they actually try and enter the workplace, but be a little bit more proactive with it.
So I'm going to look at it from a different lens. So working at The Ohio State University, within our office, we do partner really closely with a lot of different departments. And I know Mike Carroll had said this, and as well as Gretchen, that partnership is key. Because students are going to be connected to different areas across the university. Some places are going to feel more like home to them, whether that's the Military Veteran Services Office. One of the programs that I really think has been very valuable is our military community advocate program. And I know we've got a couple who have been part of that program. And one of the things that we have found that has really helped set our student veterans apart is those experiences. You know, they have had this wealth of experience that many of our students have not had. And so thinking about, once again, those articulation of those skills, whether it's in a resume or an interview, but also making those connections, and Gretchen said it really eloquently, of having, and so did Steve Stivers, about those work-based learning opportunities. You have so many of those in a university, whether it's a part-time position. Many of our veterans are working full-time. Thinking about all of those skills that they're learning, being involved with student organizations, having an internship. And I think, those type of activities really help set our student veterans apart. The other piece that I would add to this is that sometimes and this is just students in general, you might not always know how to articulate those experiences. Whether you are a non-military connected student or just, I'm going to say, a student, how do you articulate those experiences and connecting it to what employers are looking for? And there's sometimes an art and a science to it. And I think that's where some of the offices that we have across our university and the partnerships to help students with those articulation is really important. I could go on, but I'm going to go ahead and make sure others can speak.
Elena.
I think I'm going to emphasize what you said. For me, programs like the Major Lawrence Miller Advocate Program was key in landing the job where I am today. So I do suicide prevention at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and I started by interning at the Ohio State University Suicide Prevention Program. And it was the connections that I built there that I think got me the letters of recommendation that I needed, the experience that I needed. From there, I learned about volunteering at the 988 Lifeline, so I did that as well from that, and like so many other things that came from that program. And then eventually, within the Office of Military Services at The Ohio State University, we had resume workshops, which I took advantage of, and other things as well. and then taking advantage of the job fairs that Steve Stivers had as well, and eventually everything just connected. So taking advantage of all of those things eventually got me to the position where I am today. But I think programs like that was key, and just being with others who kind of understand that transition was super helpful. And framing veterans as seeing it as strength-based rather than, oh, we're like helping veterans and like beyond affirmative action and we want to retain veterans and we want to do this, but framing it as veterans have so much to offer, I think is also a shift that we need to make if we want to retain veterans and if we want to hire veterans, because veterans like do have a lot of skills and things that I feel like differ from the civilian workforce. So I think those two things are key. Yeah.
Thank you. Sean?
Sure. And that's probably a good one to start with. So I think everybody who serves in uniform starts off, I certainly hope, starts off with that sense of intense and sometimes really pervasive pride that you were part of this organization that had this huge impact not only on you, but on the way you interacted with the world. And you should never lose that pride. But when I refer to people reflexively as sir or ma'am, I know that that can sometimes be a little off-putting. So that is an interesting issue. So we talk about the ability to demonstrate flexibility and to lean into that flex, particularly when you're making the transition from a military culture into a civilian culture, where you're demonstrating, yeah, I have this astonishing pride in the service that I rendered and what it did for me. But I'm also really interested in being a part of this organization. And I'm happy to explain what that service meant to me and how it helps me be an important part of your community. You know, the translators, in terms of the MOS translators, for example, that we use in terms of job finding skills, incredibly important. My job in the military, I was an Army 27 Alpha. I was a judge advocate officer. That is an interesting job that has very little to do with the TV show Jag that was on a couple of years ago. But during that time, I worked on a number of very different missions. So when then Lieutenant Colonel Stivers was working at 73rd Troop Command, we made the transition from Troop Command being a kind of administrative organization to being a Homeland Response Force. We trained people specifically to be able to respond to natural and man-made disasters across the United States and be able to send forces that could rapidly respond to that. Well, that came in really handy a couple of years ago when General Ashurst, my boss, and I found ourselves in charge of a healthcare system that was facing COVID. That is an interesting way of looking at the world, but if you look at 27 Alpha, it's going to say, hey, McCarthy, you could go be a lawyer someplace. Well, it's probably true. I might be able to be a lawyer someplace. I went to Afghanistan with the 37th Infantry Brigade, where I spent a lot of time training people on rules of engagement, conducting investigations, working on a variety of very interesting things called rule of law training, where we tried to help the Afghan military, legal, and law enforcement professionals figure out how to run a court system. And unfortunately, that seems not to have worked out as well as we hoped. But the skills that we learned in terms of working with a bunch of very, very different organizations, I think translated into a different skill set that you might not have learned in law school. So understanding the limits of the translation of just your military experience and being able to tell the story of how your military experience actually prepares you to do what I'm going to call aggressive problem solving. And finally, I think for a lot of military students returning to the workforce, because for them it is returning to the workforce, the ability to lean into that. For them it is a return to the adult responsibilities that they embraced as 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And so they come out of the college experience. And for some, I think maybe that's a challenge. I mean, when I got out of college at 22, I was kind of an idiot. My wife might tell you I still am. But for a 26-year-old person who completed a 4-year enlistment prior to going and using their GI Bills to get through the Ohio State University or any of the fabulous universities in the state of Ohio, they come out and they're going back into a workforce where they were already successful. And so they have that opportunity to kind of come in and participate, and they had the leadership experience, and they had the problem solving, and they were tested in difficult conditions. So I think they should be comfortable with that and lean into that and say, hey, this is great, I get to go back to work.
That's great. The next question is really, I think I want to start with Gina and Nancy. We talk a lot about, and I think everybody recognizes the amazing strengths that military-connected students can bring when they enter the workforce. Can you talk for a second about what your experience shows they might be lacking and how they can address that before they get to the workforce? Are there any pitfalls or things that they should pay attention to, or best practices that we could give them to make up whatever shortfalls they might have?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things, and I know it's been talked about a couple times today, is that a lot of times those military-connected students are returning to the workforce or entering the workforce with a family. So it's not just themselves, and that can a lot of times be a barrier if childcare might not be available to them. They may not know what resources are there for things like that. So I think just depending upon where that military-connected student was in their life prior to entering the education system, there could be a plethora of barriers that are there. That being, I think, one of the biggest ones is what wraparound services can employers help provide as this individual is looking to graduate and transition into the workforce, and how can the educational institutions help bridge that gap for them and let them know, like, look, here's the resources that are out there. I think the biggest thing I can say is just knowledge and not being aware of what programs are out there, what type of assistance individuals can get either from the employer side or even from the state side.
A couple things. One thing that I thought of that, our military connected students, I think there's sometimes an assumption that, and we sometimes have this assumption about all students, oh, they just know how to do an internship search. They just know how to do a job search. And there's some skill in trying to understand that process. How do you use the resources? How do you network? I mean, we've had students say, I don't know what that means. Right. I don't know really what an internship or what is a co-op. So, even just the vernacular that we sometimes use, there might be a disconnect. And I think it's a process, and it's sometimes we may not realize how early on you need to start that process. It always pains me when I hear from students that I'm starting to look for a job and I just graduated. I just want to go, no, because that's so important, is that there's a lot of resources that they can start leveraging sooner than later. You also brought a great point about families and the impact and the transition from a family perspective. Sometimes too, and I know I'm guilty of this, is asking for help. Asking for help, whether it's through your school, through a mentor that you may have, or a professor, or an employer, or even just your network of colleagues. That can be very powerful. So sometimes just even saying, I don't know how to begin this. I think I'm interested in this, but I'm not sure. Who can I talk to? So just even voicing that, and sometimes being vulnerable can be a big risk, but it's really important too for our students to be able to think about, let me ask those questions. And that's where I think it's really important that we have offices, like our military veteran services, because I know many of our students will go to Kevin and ask him these questions, or the peer advisors across our university. So I think just having that, and I say it takes courage to ask for help, but I think that's also a piece that I would encourage any of our students and our military connected students to say, I have a question, I need help. I don't know where to begin. I don't know, I started taking these courses. I'm not sure if I really want to do this major. Or what can I do with this degree? I thought I wanted to do X, now I want to do something else. Or how do I get this work experience? Or how do I talk to people who are working in the civilian workforce that have come from a military background? So asking for help, I think, is really powerful.
That's great. Sean and Elena, since you have both been through this and you both, I think, have supported friends who've been through it, what challenges do members of the military community face when they transition from college to the workforce? Are there special challenges or issues that they face as members of the military or former members of the military?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like Mike mentioned, I think the challenges are in a continuum. So for military-connected students, I think that we come with a mentality of you're not an individual, like you're part of a team, you're part of a community. And so in a very individualistic corporate society, that can be really hard to transition into. So I think that starting early and having programs that support veterans and help them with that transition, it really makes a big difference as you're transitioning into the workforce and learning how to be more of an individual. Gretchen also mentioned how in the military you know what you need to do to get promoted. You know that you need to max your PT test. You know that you need to go to the soldier board. You know that you need to do what the steps are. And it's not as clear. You also mentioned how, for example, veterans or military-connected students may not know how to obtain an internship, and that is so true. That was my experience. I did not know where to look, like how do you become a research assistant? I have no idea how to do that. And so many other things. The workforce is highly competitive right now, and so for a lot of military-connected students, they're competing against people with multiple internships, people who did research assistantships, people who had so many experience with student organizations. And as a military-connected student, it was challenging to look for student organizations because I did not relate to the typical college experience. For military-connected students, I think that the college experience is the barracks and AIT, or our training that we have. And so I think for most military-connected students, they're past that. And to add on to that, they've had so many experiences where the regular student experience is just not relatable. So just trying to tell military-connected students, why don't you get involved, or why don't you try to look into the student organization, is not going to translate well. So I think that having those specific programs tailored to military-connected students is super important as they are building those connections, because those are going to be key in entering the workforce. Those connections are going to be how you find those internships, how you find that job. So I think those things were key for me.
Great perspective. Sean?
So I'm going to talk about military cultural training real quickly, because I think that one of the most important things to have a good transition to you to your employer is them having some degree of military cultural training, sensitivity to what our worldview is, and understand a little bit about what we bring. And I'm going to do a shameless plug for my own department and say the Ohio Department of Veteran Services offers a ton of this. We have a couple of dozen classes that we put on over the course of a year where we will train civilian employers about military cultural competency and about a variety of other topics that help smooth that transition, which is awesome. A, because it's very useful. B, they can get SHRM credit for it. We're accredited to provide those kinds of SHRM credits. That's Society of Human Resource Managers, and it is a professional organization that's very important for a lot of civilian employers. But if your employer has not yet taken advantage of that, then you have to be your own ambassador for this. Yep. You've got to be there, and you have to be able to explain, oh, you have questions that you always felt a little embarrassed about asking about what my experience was in the military. You got to take that in a pretty even-keeled approach and be able to say, oh, this is what boot camp was like for me. And it might not be identical for everybody, or this is what my MOS did on a day-to-day basis, or this is what it's like. As I walked over here, there was a crane that was being operated for some kind of repair work on the Rife building. and it was diesel powered. And anytime I smell diesel fumes, I have this kind of immediate flashback to being deployed because of that sense of diesel powered generators. That's the kind of thing that people might not really get from going through a military cultural competence training. So be available to people to good humoredly and patiently explain those kinds of experience. I do want to point out military unemployment is lower than civilian unemployment. And when we talk about the challenges, which are very real, I think it is important for our military service members as they go back into the workforce to remember they are a valuable commodity. And as they have that intense pride in their past service, they should also have, you know, kind of some sense of their value, because I think that that helps them go into that competitive environment with a whole heart.
That's great. And I might come this way, since you've always been last, let you do one first, maybe, Sean.
I'm not the smartest person out here.
But anybody can handle this question that wants. So when we think about companies and organizations that are acquiring talent, you know, what can they do to facilitate the transition for former military members to the workforce? You know, what role do employee resource groups play, transition programs, mentoring programs? Are there other ideas? And should veterans that already work for those organizations be involved in the hiring process? If so, where does that fit in? That might be, Gina might be good for that, or Sean, or anybody that wants to handle it, any of that. And I know we don't have employers on the panel, but does anybody have advice for employers?
Actually, I am. I am an employer. I've got 1,000 employees for the Ohio Department of Veteran Services. We operate 2 very large nursing homes here in the state of Ohio. We operate a variety of programs, and we do look for veterans because we do believe that they help us tell our story as a department, as a state. We think they're incredibly important. We don't always hire veterans. So I will tell you that I will not let veteran status, it is important and it is a value add to almost any position. It is not necessarily going to be a requirement for the jobs. So we have a bunch of senior leaders who are outstanding in their area where they're not veterans because we hired the best people to serve veterans for the state of Ohio. And anybody who thinks that that's a bad decision, I'll be happy to explain why I make it after we get done with the panel. But your employers in the civilian community may feel exactly the same way. We got to get the best person for the job.
They do.
I think that's fair as a veteran, as a person who works on veterans issues. You know, please send any organization to us. We'll be happy to provide them training. We do it free of charge, and we provide these credits, and we're happy to do all that. But as an employer, I love to get veterans because it is critical to our mission and because it is, and I tell people, employers, this all the time. I get a chance to talk to a lot of them over the course of a year. You know, you shouldn't hire veterans because you owe it to them out of patriotic duty, although maybe you do, or because you owe it to them because of their personal sacrifice, although maybe you do. You should hire them because they're good for the bottom line. You should hire them because they are good for your partners and your shareholders and your customers, and because they are the coworkers that your current employees can rely on. It's not that you're doing them a favor. They are bringing value to your organization.
I think that's an important perspective. Thanks, Sean. Gina, do you have any best practices that employers could or should consider as they're trying to attract veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of my biggest pieces of advice is actually in partnership with the Ohio Department of Veteran Services. The last couple years, I've actually been attending some on-base, so on military base recruiting events, and actually connecting with those transitioning service members, military spouses. And what I have learned over the last 2 years of doing that is there is such a variation from base to base, and it likely, I'm sure that transition process is different from base to base. And when these individuals are told that they need to start engaging and looking for employment. I mean, I was just at one in San Antonio a couple weeks ago, and I talked to individuals that were transitioning out in 3 months, and then talked to others that were like, oh, I'm still 2 years from my separation date. I'm just out here kind of putting the feelers out there. So I would say the biggest thing is getting in front of these individuals the soonest that employers can and are willing to in that process, getting out onto those on-base recruiting events, whether it's through Hiring Our Heroes, Recruit Military. I know there's a lot of different organizations that partner and hold those events, but getting in front of those individuals and starting that courtship process, if you will, prior to their transition is probably going to be the most helpful, not only for the employer to have that time to kind of sell it, but also for that individual to learn more about what types of opportunities are out there. If they're not necessarily looking to go back to their home of record, that's part of the work that I've been doing, is trying to woo those from outside of the state to come to Ohio, which, depending upon where the individual is, can be a difficult selling point, especially in the warmer states. But I think that there's a big tie-in with that and getting in front of those individuals. And what I say to employers is that there's never a silver bullet, right? That's recruiting civilians, recruiting transitioning service members, veterans, military spouses. There's not going to be one thing. I think it's always going to be a culmination of a lot of different efforts, making it a priority to get out in front of those individuals, get out to those bases, make connections and relationships with those transition TAPS offices, I think is a big thing. I recently attended a couple months ago at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, the VERG Summit, so that Veteran Employee Resource Group, Summit, and that was an amazing opportunity to just hear about what employers, not only in Central Ohio, but other states that traveled in, what they're doing. They literally were giving out their secret sauce for, here's what we're doing to attract and retain veteran talent. Here's what we're doing. The notes that I was taking, I took like 3 pages of notes, and I'm not even a direct employer, so I'm just out there trying to spread that good word to employers. Like, there are so many creative ways, community engagement, any opportunity for community engagement that employers can make it known, landing themselves on that military-friendly employer list, earning that badge, highlighting that, broadcasting that. I think that there's a lot of ways. I think it's a combination of being very proactive, knowing what your goals are around connecting with those veterans, right? Like, we know we can associate any military-connected individual hire as a diverse hire at this point, right? All of these employers, the Intels, the Sierra Nevadas that are, government contractors and defense contractors that are highly seeking these individuals with these transferable skills, they know they want them, they just don't have the wherewithal to figure out what the best way is to connect with those individuals. So I think it's just being very intentional from the employer side on what your goal is, what's your value prop, how you're going to sell that opportunity for those transitioning individuals, including students, and getting out there and getting in front of them.
Nancy, what role do universities play in that space, and what are the best practices universities have found in connecting veterans to organizations for employment?
Absolutely. So in some ways, I feel like we wear a consultant hat. So we, Ohio State, we're very blessed with a very prominent brand and name around the country and the world. And we have a lot of employers who come to us saying, I want to get connected with your military-connected students. How do I do that? And what our office does is we don't just meet with them as just Buckeye Careers, we go in partnership with Military Veteran Services to meet with employers. And we talk about, here's the best practices that we have seen, here's what we're hearing from our students, what they're seeking. Some of it is around policy, looking at, a military inclusive culture versus just military friendly, and the difference between what those are. It's really easy. We can go to several websites of our employers that recruit at Ohio State, and I can see military, veterans splashed all over it. But how do you dig further to that next level to say, what do you pay relocation? Do you provide any support, especially if we have this veteran who is on going to be called active duty? Are they going to get paid? Are they still going to have benefits? Will their families be taken care of? So all these different things that we try to articulate with employers about these are things that we're hearing from our military-connected students that are important to them. And sometimes they're like, oh, I never thought of that. We're going to write this down. We've also done some research too. We'll host various events where we're connecting our military-connected students with employers, and we'll do some of that digging ourselves. Really, what are those employers that who have employed these best practices? And how do we get them connected to campus and connected with their military-connected students? So that's sometimes some of the additional digging we do because we know it's really important, but it's also listening to our military-connected students. What is important to them, and how can we articulate that to the employers who want to come and recruit students?
Great, good point. And Gina talked about recruiting folks into Ohio from military bases. Maybe Elena and Sean could talk a little bit about what veterans are looking for, and Sean, maybe you can talk about what elected officials and state agencies can do to make Ohio a more attractive location for veterans to want to move here. Like, you got to move here before you work here. So how do we make Ohio a location where veterans want to live and move? We can't change the weather, Gina, I'm sorry about that, but are there other things that we can do policy-wise? Elena and Sean, what are veterans looking for when they think about where they relocate other than the weather? And as I said, I love the seasons, but not everybody does.
I love this question. I think that one of the things that I was looking at when looking at the job and the place where I want to be is veteran or military-specific benefits. So for example, most employers have some type of tuition reimbursement or something like that. I would love to see something similar to an existing program that the VA does. I think they repay up to like $250,000 of student loans. So I would love to see employers do something like repaying whatever you had to take after the GI Bill. So for people who have master's degrees, like up to, I don't know, employers already do like $5,000 a year of tuition reimbursement. Can they match that in a way for military connected students and be like, we will repay whatever you had to use after your GI Bill? So military specific benefits is what I look for, as well as employee resource group that are military specific as well. I think that is super important, and something that I'm going to mention that I've talked to Mike about, and he explains it so much better than me, is when veterans leave the military, they are forced into a binary of you're a war hero or you're broken with PTSD. And when you don't fit either one, you're kind of in the middle, like, I'm not really a veteran, like what am I if I don't fit those? And it's very easy to isolate yourself, and if you were already struggling with the transition when you were in school and then you're entering the workforce and you're isolated, your employer doesn't have military sensitivity training, they don't understand, you're being faced with microaggressions, with questions, oh, did you kill anybody when you were overseas, or things like that. So I look for a strong military culture as well. Is there military sensitivity training? Do they have employee resource groups? Is it, how military inclusive is it? So those are kind of the things that I look at.
Great points. Sean?
I'm going to take the easy part of this. How do we get people to come to Ohio?
Well, we need to hear that too.
Because I think everybody else actually already answered all the really good stuff. Ohio, especially, you think about it as a congressman and representing Ohio on that giant national stage. You know what a weird place Ohio is. We have 3 of the largest cities in the United States. We have rural districts that are as far as the eye can see, and one of the most important centers of agriculture in the world. We have manufacturing. We have, well, mountains is a stretch, but we have really, really, really big hills.
If you're in the bottom of the Hocking Hills, you'd think we have mountains.
Yes. We have beautiful terrain, and we have large cities, and we have rural communities, and we have more colleges than you can shake a stick at, including some of the best in the country. We have aerospace technology in the Dayton corridor. We have biotech here in Columbus. Intel is going to revolutionize what our general technology field is going to look like. We have traditional manufacturing, including steel manufacturing. We have just about anything that a person could be interested in, all wrapped up in a really beautiful location. You talk about the Hocking Hills, talk about the Cuyahoga River Valley, talk about the national forests at the south of the state, talk about driving down 7 on the eastern part of the state along the Ohio River. This is an extraordinarily beautiful state. We have an ODNR, and I just got a chance to talk to ODNR yesterday, that creates some of the best park experiences in the country. And for veterans, we tend to be kind of an outdoorsy people. That's not nothing. But in terms of the opportunities to do anything you are interested in as a veteran, I can't really find a better place for you to go than Ohio. And everything from, pretty progressive cultures in places like Columbus or Cleveland or Cincinnati to much more traditionally rooted value bases in a lot of our smaller communities. There are places for people to feel that they are resonating with the community that they chose. That's an amazing thing, and it doesn't happen everywhere.
Right.
So this is a state that has something for just about everybody.
That's great. I know our time is up, so what's that? I was going to say, do we have time to ask a question from the audience? And I'm sorry, I've misused my time, so you don't get a lot of questions. Does anybody in the audience have a question for the panel? Laura says we can do one. Okay.
Moved here a year ago. I run my own service-disabled veteran-owned small business. It's a consulting business. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea that we're hiring veterans. I think it's fabulous because I see that pattern's really done very well since I retired in 2010. But I want you to hire my business, not me, but just service-disabled veteran-owned small business. I'll tell you why. It isn't so much that I don't want to go to work for Intel or go to work for the state. It's because this right here is a tax write-off. The car I drove to here today is a tax write-off. My home office I rent to myself is a tax write-off. I work with the media, and so my television's a tax write-off. And one of the best things that ever happened to me in my own small business was I hired a really good accountant. And he said to me, the people who work at the IRS are grandmothers and grandfathers and uncles and all. They get it. So he said, you call me anytime you want, and you ask me if you can write this off or that off. So when I moved here from Virginia with 3 clients in Virginia, one of them could not continue because I had to go into the office for them. The other 2 did. It's still more lucrative for me to keep that business open than it is to go to work for somebody and get onboarded on their payroll system. I have my own 401k, and last year, the first year after 11 years in business, my accountant called me and said, I can't believe you finally did it. You made this much money, and you will get this many tax write-offs. So my pension went in my pocket, my disability pension went in my pocket, and some of the other income that I bring in went. So are you looking at doing anything in the state of Ohio, aside from what's required for the state as a 3% margin? I think you have to hire service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. Are you doing anything else in terms of, hey, Intel, instead of onboarding this guy and making him a permanent employee, hire his business to do something? Is that something that we're working on across the board?
So both at the state level, Senator Frank Hoagland has a bill that would create more incentive for folks to do business with veteran-owned businesses. And at the chamber, we're working with a lot of our members to encourage them to understand that veterans are great entrepreneurs and solve problems and make a difference for people, and that when they look at their supplier diversity program, it includes veterans. As we talked about up here, when people look at their DEI goals, veterans are included in them now in almost every case for employment. We need to make sure they're included in them when they look at supplier diversity as well. And that's an initiative we've got at the chamber that we're working on. I don't know if anybody else has anything. Sean, you might have some thoughts on this?
Not as smart as yours, but yeah, we certainly actually are working with both veteran-owned business recognition and disabled veteran-owned business recognition because we think that's an important part of this. I do not know that we have done as well with this as we have with some of the employment stuff. And frankly, I'm glad you brought that up because this is something I want to go back and talk to our workforce team about in terms of how we do that. But that's a conversation that we've had throughout the DeWine administration. It's just something that came up very early, and Governor DeWine was pretty aggressive about it at the beginning. It's something that I think you're absolutely right. I see an opportunity for us to get back to that in a more energetic way.
It's a great takeaway because a lot of folks are their own boss and start their own businesses, and a lot of military members, when they transition to becoming an entrepreneur, and we need to help make that successful. So I'm glad you brought it up. It's a great point. We'll do one more question, even though I'm not allowed to, I guess. Laura hasn't cut off my mic.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to touch on the concept of internships when transitioning out of college into career. And thankfully, so I have my notes here as the question that I wanted to ask. But thankfully, I had a position lined up when I was graduating. However, many positions require that experience that is gained from internships. And internships are often a way to see yourself getting a foot in the door. On the flip side of that coin, there are a lot of internships that are unpaid and require 40 hours a week, and that really closes the door for a lot of veterans and military-connected students because, as we talked about earlier on the first panel, they're paying for families and kids. And so are any of our Ohio organizations or even maybe our legislators offering incentives for considering not just minimum wage paid internships, but higher paid internships, especially for our veteran and military connected students?
Do you want to do something first? And then
Sure,
Yep.
sure. I'll just say the two programs specifically that I'm aware of is actually from the DoD side, which I know some employers have had a lot of success with, is participating in the Skill Bridge program, which is a good way to capitalize on someone who's still actively in the process of transitioning out of their military career and can obtain that internship at a company and is being paid still from their military employer, if you will, during that time working with that company for whatever that internship period is. I also know recently, I actually just think it was earlier this year, that there's also the Military Spouse Career Accelerator Program that exists, which is pretty similar to the Skill Bridge for that transitioning service member. This one's more so targeted at that military spouse. So I definitely think that those are programs that not a lot of employers, unfortunately, do participate and capitalize on. Those are ones that I keep pushing employers to make sure that they're signing up for, especially if they're looking to engage with that highly valuable, highly desirable skills that service members do bring with them.
I met with a legislator yesterday, I will tell you, that is interested in addressing this bigger problem, and not necessarily focused on military students, but all students, that to encourage companies to provide paid internships as opposed to just internships that are unpaid, which limits a lot of college students that don't have the means or are working their way through college already or something like that. So there is an effort underway that I know one legislator's working on really hard. It's at the very infant stages. We were talking ideas and thoughts. It is not something that's going to happen immediately, but I think he's eyeing this something in the capacity building $750 million pot that is coming next year. So something could be built by late next year, would be my guess, because it'll take time to be built after it's funded. But there could be an incentive for employers to offer paid internships in Ohio at some point soon. Thank you, everybody. Could everybody give a big round of applause to this panel?